It was a case that made national news. It was cold for 3.5 decades. Then an arrest was made in the murder of 12-year-old Jonelle Matthews. And as Amber Cagliano reports, the suspect once ran for governor.
This is Greeley, Colorado. 38 years ago, a 12-year-old girl vanished here, 5 days before Christmas, and wouldn't be found for 35 years. When she finally was, investigators learned she'd been shot in the head. Justice for Jonelle has been denied. That's about to change. Hours before she disappeared, she'd been singing Christmas carols with her school choir. That performance would be the last time anyone ever saw her sing. Then she walked through her own front door, and she never walked back out. Her shoes sat on the floor where she'd kicked them off. The space heater was still humming. Half-finished Christmas gifts lay beside her spot on the couch, like she'd just stepped away for a second. The man responsible spent those 35 years living freely. He even ran for governor, twice. Why would a man building a political career shoot a 12-year-old girl in the head and bury her in a field? That question sat unanswered for 37 years, until he answered it himself. Jonelle Matthews began her life as a secret, then became the center of someone else's whole world. She was born February 9, 1972, in Santa Barbara, California, to a 13-year-old girl who couldn't raise her. 6 weeks later, a couple named Jim and Gloria Matthews adopted her. They already had one daughter, Jennifer. Now they had two. The family eventually settled in Greeley, Colorado, a small farming town about 60 miles north of Denver. Jim worked as an elementary school principal. Gloria worked at a local restaurant. The family was active in their church community. And then there was Jonelle. People who knew her describe her the same way, over and over. Loud, in the best sense of the word. Theatrical. Funny. The kind of kid who made a sleepover feel like an event. She loved performing, whether that was singing in choir or acting in church skits. And like most 12-year-old girls in 1984, she was completely devoted to the boy band Menudo. By December of that year, she was a 7th grader at Franklin Middle School in Greeley, singing with the school's honor choir, and counting down to Christmas, 5 days away, with the kind of excitement that made the season feel endless. She had no way of knowing that countdown would never reach Christmas morning. A 12-year-old girl, 5 days from Christmas, with no idea what was coming. If stories like hers deserve to be told right, subscribe. We go this deep into new cases, all the time. December 20th, 1984 fell on a Thursday, 5 days before Christmas. That night, Jonelle stood on stage with Franklin Middle School's honor choir, singing carols at a Christmas concert broadcast on local cable. Her father wasn't there to see it. He was 30 miles away at her sister's basketball game. Her mother was out of state, at her own father's bedside in California. After the concert, a friend's father offered Jonelle a ride home. They pulled into her driveway a little before 8. She said goodnight, walked up to the house, and went inside. The car didn't leave right away. In the Matthews household, there was an understanding. Flick the porch light once you're safely inside, and whoever dropped you off knows to go. That night, the light came on, just like it always did. The car pulled away. No one in it knew they had just watched Jonelle Matthews for the last time. At 8:30, the phone rang. Jonelle picked up, took a message for her father, and hung up. A small, unremarkable moment. It would become the final trace of her that anyone could ever confirm. An hour later, her father came home to a house that didn't add up. The garage door stood open. The television was still playing to no one. The space heater by her favorite chair was still humming. Her shoes sat empty on the floor, and her stockings lay across the couch, as if she'd meant to come right back. She never did. Jim called the police that night. Officers arrived and searched the house for anything that could explain where his daughter had gone. They found nothing broken, nothing forced. No sign that anyone had fought their way inside. Outside, in the fresh snow beneath the living room window, they found footprints. Someone had been standing there, close enough to look in, and someone had taken a rake, pulled straight from the Matthews' own garage, and dragged it across the snow, trying to erase whatever tracks had been left behind. At first, investigators considered the possibility that Jonelle had simply run away. Jim didn't believe it, and within days, neither did anyone else. She'd left without her shoes, in the middle of a Colorado winter. She had a sleepover planned. She loved Christmas more than almost anything. The theory collapsed almost as quickly as it was raised. With no obvious suspect, investigators turned to the person closest to her, her father. Jim agreed to a polygraph test, administered by an FBI agent described as one of the best interrogators west of the Mississippi. He was told he'd failed. He took a second test with local police. He kept telling them the same thing, over and over, until he was finally cleared. Investigators even placed Jonelle's birth mother under surveillance for weeks, without ever telling her that her daughter was missing. This was 1984. There was no Amber Alert system. DNA analysis, as a forensic tool, was still years away from existing. What law enforcement had were photographs, telephones, and shoe leather. So that's what they used. Jonelle's photo went out on milk cartons across the country. Her case grew large enough that President Ronald Reagan mentioned her by name in a national address on missing children. And still, nothing. An innocent father, put through polygraph after polygraph, while the real answer sat somewhere else entirely. Quite tragic, honestly. Subscribe. We go this deep into new cases, all the time. Staying in Greeley became unbearable. Every street corner held a memory. Every knock at the door was, for a moment, a possibility. Eventually, the Matthews family made the decision to leave the town they'd built their entire life in. Years passed. 5 became 10. 10 became 15. Gloria later said that no matter where they went, she never stopped looking for her daughter's face in a crowd. She described a recurring dream, one where Jonelle simply walked back through the door, smiling, as if no time had passed at all. In the dream, she always came home. In reality, she never did. By 1994, a full decade had gone by without a single new lead. No tip that went anywhere. No suspect. Nobody. That year, Jim and Gloria made a decision no parent should ever have to make. They had Jonelle legally declared dead. It wasn't closure. There was nothing to bury, nothing to point to, no answer to the only question that mattered. It was simply a formal acknowledgement of what a decade of silence had already made clear. For the next 25 years, the file on Jonelle Matthews sat largely untouched. No breakthroughs, no arrests. No name ever surfaced as a serious suspect. An entire generation grew up in Greeley, never learning what had happened to the girl on the milk carton. Somewhere, the answer was waiting. It would take another quarter century for anyone to find it. In 1984, a man named Stephen Panky lived about 2 miles from the Matthews home. He had briefly attended the same church the family belonged to. He was 33 years old, married, with a young son. 2 days before Jonelle disappeared, Panky was arrested at a local bank for causing a disturbance. It was a small, unrelated incident, one of several minor run-ins he'd had with police over the years. Then, according to his ex-wife, Angela Hicks, something changed the day after Jonelle vanished. Panky came home and announced they were leaving town, suddenly, before daylight the next morning, to visit his parents in California for Christmas. On the drive back to Colorado, Hicks says Panky did something that didn't fit the man she knew. He had banned television, radio, and newspapers from their household for nearly a year, calling it a godly home. That day, in the car, he ordered her to turn on the radio. He wanted news. Specifically, he wanted to hear anything about a missing girl from Greeley. Hicks says he made her search the stations for hours. Once they were back, she says Panky drove straight to a store, bought every local newspaper he could find, and had her read every article about Jonelle's disappearance out loud, more than once. That same week, he began digging in the yard, telling Hicks it was a septic issue, despite the fact that their septic system had recently been replaced. Around the same time, a car stored on the property caught fire. A month after Jonelle disappeared, Panky contacted the FBI himself. He identified himself as a minister who'd received information through a private confession, and said he had knowledge that could help the investigation. In exchange, he wanted immunity. Investigators noted his name. They didn't grant the immunity, but they didn't forget him either. Neighbors would later describe another habit of his, watching children walk home from the middle school Jonelle had attended. If you were investigating this case in 1984, would any of this have made you suspicious, or would it have just seemed strange? Let us know in the comments. After Panky's family left Colorado, they moved through several states before settling in Idaho by the late 1980s. And there, something strange began. Panky started running for office. He ran for sheriff, he ran for city council, he ran for lieutenant governor, he ran for governor of Idaho, not once, but twice, in 2014 and again in 2018. He lost every single time, badly. In his final attempt, he pulled less than 1.5% of the vote. But politics wasn't really what he was doing. Underneath every campaign, every court filing, every legal letter he wrote over 3 decades, Panky kept doing something no innocent man had any reason to do. He kept bringing up Jonelle Matthews. When investigators eventually searched his home, they found more than 1,000 documents that referenced her, scattered across cases that had nothing to do with Colorado, nothing to do with a missing girl, nothing to do with any of it, except that he'd written her name into them anyway. In a 1999 filing to the Idaho Supreme Court, tied to an unrelated conviction, Panky claimed the case against him was actually an attempt to force him to become an informant in Jonelle's disappearance. In that same filing, he wrote that he feared he might face the death penalty for revealing the location of her body. A few months after Jonelle vanished, a minister at Panky's church told the congregation he'd received a message that she'd be found alive. Panky reportedly muttered that the man was a false prophet and had to be removed from the service. In 2008, Panky's own son was murdered. At the funeral, standing over his son's remains, his ex-wife says he leaned down and said he hoped God hadn't let this happen because of Jonelle Matthews. For 3 decades, a missing girl's name kept surfacing in a stranger's mouth, in places it never should have. On July 23, 2019, a construction crew was installing a new pipeline through a remote stretch of farmland in Weld County, about 15 miles southeast of Greeley. It was routine work, the kind of job that happens on land like that every year, until the equipment struck something that had been waiting in the ground for 35 years. Human remains. The site was processed carefully. Investigators recovered what they could and sent everything to the Weld County Coroner's Office for identification. 2 days later, they had an answer, confirmed through DNA. The remains belonged to Jonelle Matthews. The discovery reopened a case that had gone quiet for a quarter century, but it also answered a question that had haunted the Matthews family since 1984, one they'd almost stopped letting themselves ask. What had actually happened to her? The autopsy provided that answer, and it changed everything about how this case would be understood. Jonelle's cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. This had never been a runaway case, and it had never been a simple disappearance. Someone had taken her, driven her miles from her home, and shot her. For Gloria Matthews, the discovery closed one door and opened another. She could no longer hope her daughter might still be alive somewhere, but she finally had somewhere to direct 35 years of unanswered questions. Weeks later, Greeley police made an announcement that connected a name to the case for the very first time. Stephen Panky, a former resident who had once lived 2 miles from the Matthews home, was named a person of interest in Jonelle's disappearance and death. The file that had sat untouched for 25 years was moving again. In every major investigation, police keep certain details deliberately secret, facts that only the perpetrator could possibly know. It's a safeguard, a way of separating a real confession from someone who simply wants attention. In Jonelle's case, one detail was held back for decades: the fact that whoever took her had used a rake to smooth over the footprints in the snow outside her home. Investigators never released this to the press. Not in 1984, not in any of the years that followed. As far as the public record was concerned, it didn't exist, and yet somehow, Stephen Panky knew about it. He brought it up himself, in a 2019 conversation with investigators, describing the raked-over snow as though it were common knowledge. It wasn't. His own former defense attorney would later admit, in public comments, that this single detail was arguably the strongest piece of evidence tying his client to the crime, because there was no innocent way to explain how he knew it. Angela Hicks, his ex-wife, gave investigators something that made the detail even harder to dismiss. She testified that she once found a piece of paper in the trash, written in Panky's own handwriting. On it, he'd noted, plainly, that the snow outside the Matthews house had been raked. Not a rumor he'd heard, not a detail he was guessing at. Written down, in his own hand, years before it ever became public. For a man who spent 3 decades insisting he knew nothing about what happened to Jonelle Matthews, It was one detail too specific and too accurate to explain away. In October 2021, Stephen Panky went on trial for the kidnapping and murder of Jonelle Matthews. There was no DNA connecting him to the crime, no murder weapon, no physical evidence at all. The entire case rested on decades of his own words and behavior. His defense argued exactly that. Strange doesn't mean guilty. Prosecutors argued the opposite, that no innocent man behaves the way Panky had for 37 years. Then Panky made a decision that stunned even his own legal team. Against the advice of his attorneys, he chose to testify. He was on the stand for 2 days. Much of it was rambling, contradictory, difficult to follow. He admitted, under oath, that he had lied to investigators for years, about his father-in-law, about a supposed pastoral confession, about having information he never actually had. He told the jury he'd made things up out of bitterness toward people he resented. His explanation for the rake detail: he claimed law enforcement had told him about it themselves. Prosecutors weren't convinced. At one point, one of them asked him directly whether Jonelle had been begging for her life. Panky didn't answer. On November 4th, 2021, after days of deliberation, the jury returned. They found him guilty on a single count, filing false statements to police, tied specifically to the documents he'd given investigators about his family's trip to California in the days after Jonelle disappeared. On the murder and kidnapping charges, the jury couldn't agree. The judge declared a mistrial. For the Matthews family, it wasn't an acquittal, but it wasn't justice either. It was nothing at all. Panky's defense didn't rest on his own innocence alone. His attorney offered the jury a different name entirely: Norris Drake. Drake had grown up across the street from the Matthews family. His mother and sister lived there in 1984, and Drake himself was at his mother's house the night Jonelle disappeared. According to his defense's theory, he was unaccounted for during part of that evening. There was no sign of forced entry at the Matthews home, no struggle, nothing broken. Panky's attorney argued that made more sense if Jonelle had known her abductor, someone she might have opened the door for without a second thought, or agreed to leave with, if he'd told her something was wrong. The defense also pointed out that Drake, unlike Panky, had actually been questioned by police back in 1984, and a former girlfriend of his later testified that Drake had shown an interest in young girls who'd recently reached puberty. Investigators at the time had looked into Drake. His mother told them he was home with her at the time Jonelle went missing, and that alibi closed the door on him as a suspect. Norris Drake died in 2007, 12 years before Jonelle's remains were ever found. He was never charged with anything connected to her case. The theory gave the jury a second name to consider, a genuine alternative, raised in open court, not dismissed outright. Whether it created real doubt, or simply added one more strange thread to an already complicated case, is something each juror had to decide for themselves. A year after the mistrial, prosecutors brought Stephen Panky back to court. A second jury would hear the same decades of evidence, the same self-incriminating pattern, and decide what the first jury couldn't. On October 31st, 2022, they reached their verdict: guilty of felony murder, guilty of second-degree kidnapping with a deadly weapon, guilty, again, of false reporting to authorities. On the charge of first-degree murder after deliberation, the jury found him not guilty, but the felony murder conviction carried the same weight: a sentence of life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. At sentencing, Jonelle's older sister, Jennifer Mogensen, addressed the court directly. She told the room that 12,634 days had passed since her sister disappeared. Days her husband never got to know Jonelle. Days her own son never got to meet an aunt he would never have. Jim Matthews spoke next, directly to the man who had taken his daughter. He told Panky there was still time to confess, still time to be honest, still a door open if he chose to walk through it. He said the gates of heaven could still be open for him, and that it wasn't too late. Judge Timothy Kearns addressed the family before passing sentence, calling their loss unspeakable and offering them what he could. Not quite closure, but some sense of finality. When given the chance to speak, Panky offered only 3 sentences. He said he was a Christian. He said he would be in heaven. He said he was innocent, and that this was not justice for Jonelle. 38 years after a 12-year-old girl walked through her own front door, someone was finally held responsible. 38 years is a long time to wait for a sentence like this. Subscribe. We cover the ones that took too long to solve. Stephen Panky is currently serving his sentence at the Arkansas Valley Correctional Facility in Ordway, Colorado. He and his attorneys have pursued appeals, questioning the trial's venue, the evidence presented, and the process that convicted him. Legal experts following the case note that overturning a conviction built on this much-documented, self-generated evidence, decades of his own letters, filings, and statements, is an extraordinarily difficult path. As it stands, there is no indication that path will succeed. For 35 years, Jonelle Matthews existed to the world mostly as an image, a face on a milk carton, a photograph on the news, a name attached to a question nobody could answer. Her family knew her as more than that. A daughter, a sister, a 12-year-old who loved to sing, who counted down to Christmas, who flicked on a porch light one night to let someone know she'd made it home safely. She never got to grow up. She never got to find out what her life might have looked like past that December. But she is no longer just a face on a carton, or an open file gathering dust in an evidence room. She has a name people know, a story people can finally point to and say, this is what happened, and this is who did it. It took 38 years. It shouldn't have taken that long. But Jonelle Matthews is not a mystery anymore.